They wanted her to fail. They watched her starve. And they waited for the day they could buy her land for nothing. By the second autumn after her husband's death, Evelyn Mercer knew the truth. Her farm wasn't cursed. It was being murdered. Beneath the northern field, a collapsed water channel was slowly killing everything she had left. She'd found it 2 years ago, but repairing it alone was impossible. Broke, exhausted, and raising a young son, she had two choices: surrender the land to the men circling like vultures, or find a miracle. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The kitchen window faced west, which meant Evelyn Mercer watched the sun die every single night. She stood at the basin now, hands submerged in cold dishwater, staring past the cracked glass toward the orchard. The apple trees looked skeletal against the October sky. Branches heavy with leaves but almost no fruit. A few withered apples clung to the highest limbs like forgotten ornaments. Last year there had been more. The year before that, even more. Every season, less. Behind her, Caleb sat at the table pushing beans around his plate with a wooden spoon. He was 7 years old, too thin for his age, with his father's dark hair and a quietness that made him seem older than he was. "You gonna eat those or just move them in circles till bedtime?" Evelyn asked without turning around. "Not hungry." "That's the third night this week you've said that." "Still not hungry." Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and turned to face him. The boy's clothes were clean but patched in multiple places. His boots, the ones his father had worn at that age, were stuffed with folded cloth because they were still too big. "Caleb." He looked up. Those eyes were too serious for a child. "You need to eat." "I know." He scooped a single bean into his mouth and chewed it like it was made of sawdust. Evelyn wanted to say something else, something that would make him smile the way he used to before his father died. But the words didn't come. They rarely did anymore. So she turned back to the window and watched the light fade from the dying orchard. The farm had been in her husband's family for 3 generations. 22 acres of river valley land, rich soil that should have produced crops so thick you could barely walk between the rows. The western field alone used to yield enough wheat to carry them through 2 winters. The orchard had once been famous. People came from 2 counties over just to buy Mercer apples. That was before Thomas fell from the barn roof and broke his neck, before the debt started piling up, before the land started failing in ways that made no sense. Now the western field flooded every spring and cracked into hard clay every summer. The irrigation ditches ran dry even after heavy rain. The apple trees bloomed late and produced fruit that rotted before it ripened. Neighbors whispered about the Mercer curse like it was something in the soil itself, something rotten that couldn't be fixed. Evelyn had hired 4 different men to diagnose the problem. The first one, a gray-haired farmer named Hutchins, had walked the property for 2 hours, poking at the ground with a stick and muttering to himself. At the end, he'd stood on the porch and said, "Some land just goes sour, Mrs. Mercer. Ain't nothing to be done about it." The second man, younger and more confident, had charged her $3 to dig a few test holes and declare that the soil had lost its spirit. When she'd asked what that meant, he'd shrugged and suggested she pray about it. The third never even finished his inspection. He'd taken one look at the western field, shaken his head, and ridden off without explanation. The fourth man, a licensed surveyor from the county seat, had been the most honest. He'd told her the land was beyond saving and that she should sell while she still could. She'd shown him the door. But late at night, when Caleb was asleep and the house was silent except for the wind rattling the loose shingles, Evelyn allowed herself to think the thought she refused to speak out loud. Maybe they were right. Maybe the land really was cursed, except she knew better. 2 years ago, during the first terrible summer after Thomas died, she'd been desperate enough to do something she'd never done before. She'd grabbed a shovel and started digging. Not random holes like the so-called experts, she'd dug with purpose, following the irrigation lines, tracing the water flow from the main channel down through the network of clay pipes her husband's grandfather had installed decades ago. It had taken her 3 weeks, but she'd found it. Beneath the northern field, about 6 feet down, the main water channel had collapsed. Not cracked, collapsed. A full section of the clay pipe had caved in on itself, creating a blockage that choked off water to half the property. The western field flooded because the water had nowhere to go. The orchard suffered because it wasn't getting enough. It wasn't a curse. It was broken plumbing, and fixing it would have been simple for two men with the right tools and half a day's work. But Evelyn had been alone. She'd tried. She'd spent a full week digging out the collapsed section, but every time she got close, the trench walls caved in. The clay soil was too unstable, the hole too deep. She'd nearly been buried twice. On the second time, Caleb had found her waist-deep in mud, struggling to climb out, and the look of terror on his face had ended the project immediately. She'd filled in the trench, said nothing to anyone, and tried to survive another season. Because what was the alternative? Tell people the truth and admit she couldn't fix it? Watch them offer sympathy while secretly calculating how cheap they could buy the land when she finally gave up? No. She'd buried the problem the same way she'd buried her husband. And now, 2 years later, the farm was dying anyway. Ma? Evelyn blinked. Caleb was standing beside her now, holding his empty plate. I ate them, he said quietly. She looked down. The plate was clean. Good boy. She took the plate and set it in the basin. Go get ready for bed. Can I check the traps first? It's almost dark. I'll be quick. She wanted to say no, wanted to keep him inside where it was safe and warm, but the traps were important. 2 rabbits this week meant meat they didn't have to buy. Stay close to the house and take the lantern. He was out the door before she finished the sentence. Evelyn watched through the window as his small silhouette moved across the yard toward the tree line, the lantern swinging in his hand. He moved carefully, the way Thomas used to move, like someone who understood that the world didn't owe you safety. She hated that he'd learned that so young. The sun was gone now. The sky had turned that deep purple color that came right before full dark. In the distance, she could see the faint glow of town, a handful of lights from the saloon, the general store, the blacksmith's forge. Coldwater wasn't much of a town, maybe 300 people if you counted the surrounding ranches. 1 main street, a dozen buildings, and a church with a bell that didn't ring anymore because no one wanted to pay to fix it. Thomas used to joke that Coldwater was the kind of place people left, not the kind they came to. But it was home. Or it had been. Now it felt like a trap. Every time she went into town, she felt the stares. Women whispering behind her back at the general store. Men tipping their hats with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Everyone waiting for her to fail so they could swoop in and buy the land for a fraction of what it was worth. She wasn't imagining it. Last month, Clayton Harris, who owned the ranch bordering her eastern property line, had stopped by to check on her. He'd stood on the porch in his expensive coat and clean boots, looking at her with the kind of pity that made her want to spit. Evelyn, I know things have been hard since Thomas passed, he'd said. If you ever decide the farm's too much to handle alone, I'd be happy to make you a fair offer. Fair. The way he'd said it made her skin crawl. I appreciate the concern, Clayton, but I'm managing just fine. Are you? He'd glanced past her toward the orchard where half the trees were already bare. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like the land's eating you alive. She'd closed the door in his face, but his words had stayed with her. The land's eating you alive. Maybe it was. She was 31 years old and felt 50. Her hands were calloused and cracked. Her back ached every morning. She'd sold almost everything valuable, her mother's silver, Thomas's pocket watch, even the good dishes they'd received as a wedding gift. The only things left were the land and her pride, and she was running out of both. A knock at the door startled her. Evelyn froze. It was full dark now. Nobody came calling after sundown unless something was wrong. She grabbed the rifle from above the doorframe and held it low against her leg as she approached. Who's there? Name's Silas Reed, ma'am. I'm looking for work. The voice was low, calm, not threatening, but not friendly either. Just factual. Evelyn cracked the door open, keeping the rifle ready. The man on her porch was tall and lean, maybe 40 years old, with dark hair going gray at the temples. He wore a battered coat and boots that had seen a lot of miles. His face was weathered, but not unkind. We're not hiring, Evelyn said. Didn't ask if you were. Asked if you needed work done. Same thing. Not really. He glanced past her toward the kitchen. Noticed your chimney's leaking smoke into the house. Means the flue's blocked, or the bricks have shifted. Either way, it'll get worse when winter hits. Evelyn hadn't noticed, but now that he mentioned it, she could smell it. The faint trace of smoke that had been lingering in the kitchen for weeks. I can fix it for a meal and a place to sleep in the barn, the man continued. No money required. I don't know you. No, ma'am, you don't. So why should I let a stranger sleep on my property? Silas Reed looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were gray and steady. Because that chimney's going to fill your house with smoke in about 2 weeks, and your boy's going to wake up coughing every night until spring. You can hire someone from town for $10, or you can let me fix it for free. Evelyn's grip tightened on the rifle. How do you know I have a boy? Saw him checking traps when I rode up. Moves quiet for his age. You taught him well. It wasn't a threat, just an observation. But something about the way he said it made Evelyn pause. This man had been watching. I appreciate the offer, she said slowly, but I'll manage on my own. Silas nodded once, like he'd expected that answer. Fair enough. He turned to leave, then stopped. One more thing, ma'am. Your northern irrigation line, it's not cursed. Evelyn's blood went cold. Excuse me? The reason your land's failing, it's not bad luck or sour soil. Your main water channel collapsed. Probably 6 feet down, buried under clay. Easy fix for 2 people. Impossible for 1. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was commenting on the weather. Evelyn's heart was pounding now. How do you know that? Same way I know your chimney's blocked. I pay attention. He tipped his hat. Good night, Mrs. Mercer. And then he was gone, walking back toward the road where a horse stood waiting in the shadows. Evelyn stood in the doorway, rifle trembling in her hands, watching him disappear into the dark. Nobody knew about the collapsed channel. Nobody. She'd told no one. She'd filled in the trench and buried the secret because admitting the truth meant admitting she couldn't fix it alone. So how the hell did a stranger know? Ma. Caleb's voice came from the yard. Evelyn stepped outside and saw him running toward the house, lantern swinging wildly. There's a man by the road. I know. It's all right. Who is he? Evelyn didn't answer. She watched the shadows where Silas Reed had vanished, her mind racing. A drifter looking for work wasn't unusual. Plenty of men rode through Coldwater looking for day labor. But a drifter who knew about collapsed irrigation lines? That was something else. Caleb reached the porch, breathing hard. Did he try to hurt you? No, baby. He was just asking about work. Are you going to hire him? Evelyn looked down at her son. His face was pale in the lantern light, eyes wide with worry. I don't know yet. But even as she said it, her mind was already turning. If Silas Reed really knew about the water channel, that meant one of 2 things. Either he'd been spying on her property for weeks, which was terrifying, or he actually understood land and water systems well enough to diagnose the problem just by looking, which was potentially useful. Both options were dangerous, but desperation had a way of making dangerous things look reasonable. Come on, she said, guiding Caleb inside. Let's get you to bed. That night, after Caleb was asleep, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her. The numbers didn't lie. She had $43 left. Rent on the land was due in 2 months, $60. She owed the general store $18 for supplies. The seed she'd need for spring planting would cost at least $20. Even if she sold every apple in the orchard and every bushel of wheat in the western field, she'd still come up short. And that was assuming the crops didn't fail again. She closed the ledger and pressed her palms against her eyes. Thomas used to handle the numbers. He'd sit at this same table every Sunday night, writing in his careful handwriting, making everything add up. Even in the hard years, he'd always found a way. But Thomas was gone, and Evelyn was drowning. She thought about Clayton Harris and his fair offer, thought about the other ranchers who'd been circling the property like buzzards. They were all waiting for the same thing, for her to break. And she was so damn close. But then she thought about Silas Reed. Your northern irrigation line, it's not cursed. Nobody in 2 years had said anything like that. Not the experts she'd hired, not the neighbors who claimed to care. Everyone had treated the failing farm like a mystery, like some act of nature beyond understanding. But Silas had looked at the land and seen the truth immediately, which meant either he was very skilled or he'd known about the problem all along. Evelyn stood and walked to the window. The barn was visible in the moonlight, dark and empty, except for the 2 remaining cows and the old plow horse. If she let Silas Reed sleep there, she'd be trusting a stranger with access to her property, her animals, her son. But if she didn't, the farm would die. and so would any chance of keeping it. She stood there for a long time, weighing the risks, calculating the odds. Finally, she made her decision. Tomorrow morning, she'd ride into town and ask around about Silas Reed. If anyone knew him, if he'd caused trouble anywhere, she'd run him off the property with the rifle. But if he was clean, maybe desperation and a stranger's knowledge were exactly what she needed. She blew out the lamp and headed upstairs, exhausted but unable to sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shingles and whistling through the gaps in the barn walls. And somewhere in the darkness, a man named Silas Reed made camp by the creek, knowing exactly what choice Evelyn Mercer would make. Because desperate people were predictable, and broken things always needed fixing. But the next morning dawned cold and gray. Evelyn woke before sunrise, dressed quickly, and headed downstairs to start the fire. Caleb was still asleep. She could hear his soft breathing from the small room off the kitchen that used to be a pantry. She worked quietly, measuring coffee into the pot, slicing bread, trying to ignore the faint smell of smoke that Silas Reed had been right about. Damn him. By the time the sun crept over the hills, she'd made up her mind. She'd ride into town, ask her questions, and be back before noon. But when she stepped outside to saddle the horse, she stopped dead. Silas Reed was sitting on her porch. He stood when he saw her, holding his hat in his hands. "Morning, ma'am." Evelyn's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle inside the door. "I told you we weren't hiring." "You did." He nodded toward the barn. "But your chimney's still broken, and your land's still dying. Figured I'd wait and see if you changed your mind." "That's called trespassing." "Yes, ma'am, it is." He didn't move, just stood there, calm as anything. "I'll leave if you want. But before I do, you should know something." "What?" "The men in town, the ones who've been waiting for you to fail, they already know about the collapsed water channel." Evelyn felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "That's a lie." "No, ma'am, it's not." Silas's voice was quiet but firm. "I was at the saloon last night, heard Clayton Harris and 2 others talking. They've known for over a year. They're just waiting for you to give up so they can buy the land cheap and fix it themselves." The world tilted. Evelyn grabbed the porch railing to steady herself. "You're lying," she said again, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "I've got no reason to lie." Silas put his hat back on. "But I understand if you don't believe me. Like you said, you don't know me." He turned to leave. "Wait." He stopped. Evelyn's mind was racing. If what he said was true, if the men in town had known all along, that meant they'd watched her struggle for 2 years, watched her sell everything she owned, watched her son go hungry, all so they could steal her land. She looked at Silas Reed, this stranger who'd appeared out of nowhere with answers no one else had given her. "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I don't like watching vultures circle." "And what do you get out of it?" "A place to sleep, maybe a couple meals, and the satisfaction of fixing something that's broken." "That's it?" "That's it." Evelyn studied his face, looking for the lie, the angle, the hidden price. But all she saw was a tired man who looked like he'd been running from something for a long time, just like her. "The barn's got a leak in the northwest corner," she said finally, "and the door doesn't latch properly. You'll freeze at night." "I've slept in worse." "I can't pay you." "Didn't ask you to." Evelyn took a breath. "If you steal from me, I'll shoot you." "Yes, ma'am." "And if you so much as look at my son the wrong way, I'll leave before that happens." She believed him. She didn't know why, but she did. "All right, then." She stepped aside. "Barn's yours. We eat at sundown. Don't expect anything fancy." Silas nodded once and headed toward the barn without another word. Evelyn watched him go, her heart pounding. She'd just invited a stranger onto her failing farm based on nothing but desperation and a gut feeling. Thomas would have called her reckless. But Thomas wasn't here, and reckless was all she had left. Silas worked in silence. For 3 days, Evelyn barely saw him, except at mealtimes. He'd appear at the kitchen door exactly at sundown, hat in hand, boots scraped clean of mud. He'd eat whatever she put in front of him without comment, thank her quietly, and disappear back to the barn before Caleb could ask him more than 2 questions. On the 4th morning, Evelyn found him on the roof. She'd walked outside to feed the chickens and nearly dropped the bucket when she saw him perched on the peak of the house, pulling bricks out of the chimney one by one. "What the hell are you doing up there?" she called. "Fixing your chimney." "I didn't ask you to do that yet." "You didn't ask me not to." He pulled another brick loose and examined it. "This one's cracked clean through. You've got 3 more just like it. The whole top section needs rebuilding or you'll have a house fire by January." Evelyn shaded her eyes against the morning sun. From the ground, Silas looked impossibly high up, balanced on the steep pitch like it was nothing. "You fall off my roof and break your neck, that's your own fault," she said. "Yes, ma'am. And I'm not paying you extra for work I didn't approve." "Didn't ask you to." She wanted to argue, but he'd already gone back to work, pulling bricks with the kind of careful precision that came from years of practice. Evelyn watched him for another moment, then went back to feeding the chickens, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in her chest that might have been gratitude. By noon, Silas had torn down the top 4 rows of brickwork and was rebuilding them with fresh mortar he'd mixed himself from lime and sand he'd found in the barn. Evelyn had no idea where he'd learned to do that, but she wasn't about to ask. Caleb, however, had no such reservations. The boy appeared at Evelyn's elbow while she was hanging laundry, staring up at the roof with wide eyes. "How's he staying up there without falling?" "Practice, I imagine." "Can I go up and watch?" "Absolutely not." "But, Ma," I said, "No, Caleb. That roof's steep, and you're not old enough." "I'm almost 8. Almost doesn't count." She pinned a sheet to the line and glanced at him. "You finish your chores?" "Yes, ma'am." "All of them? Including mucking the stalls?" Caleb's face fell. "I was going to do that after—" "Do it now." He trudged off toward the barn, shoulders slumped in defeat, and Evelyn felt a pang of guilt. The boy had so little to be excited about these days, but letting him climb on roofs wasn't the answer. She went back to hanging laundry, trying not to think about how much easier this would have been with Thomas here. He would have fixed the chimney himself, would have known exactly what to say to make Caleb laugh instead of mope, would have known whether trusting Silas Reed was smart or suicidal. By evening, the chimney was finished. Silas climbed down just as the sun started to set, covered in brick dust and dried mortar. He stood in the yard, brushing off his hands and examining his work with a critical eye. "Should hold for another 20 years, he said when Evelyn came out to call him for supper. "Longer if you keep the cap clear of debris." Evelyn looked up at the chimney. It looked exactly the same as before, except straighter somehow. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. Silas nodded once and headed toward the barn to wash up. That night at supper, Caleb broke the silence. "How'd you learn to fix chimneys?" Silas looked up from his plate. "Practice." "Where?" "Different places." "Like where?" "Caleb," Evelyn warned, but Silas didn't seem bothered. He set down his fork and considered the question. "Worked on a ranch in Montana for a while. Owner had 6 chimneys and all of them leaked. Learned by fixing my mistakes." "Were you a cowboy?" Caleb's eyes lit up. "Sometimes." "Did you have a gun?" "Caleb, that's enough," Evelyn said sharply. Silas picked up his fork again. "It's all right. Yeah, I had a gun. Don't anymore." "Why not?" "Didn't need it." Caleb opened his mouth to ask another question, but Evelyn cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging bull. The boy went back to his food, sulking. They ate in silence for a while. Then Silas spoke again, his voice quiet. "Your boy asked a fair question, Mrs. Mercer. I don't mind answering. He's too curious for his own good. Curious isn't a bad thing. It is when it gets you into trouble." Silas looked at her, something unreadable in his gray eyes. Trouble's going to find him whether he's curious or not. Might as well let him ask questions while he can. Evelyn wanted to snap back, wanted to tell this stranger he had no right to comment on how she raised her son. But the words stuck in her throat because part of her knew he was right. She stood abruptly and started clearing plates. "Caleb, go check the animals before bed." "But I already—" "Do it again." The boy left without another word. Alone in the kitchen with Silas, Evelyn felt the weight of the silence pressing down. She scrubbed a plate harder than necessary, keeping her back to him. "I appreciate the work you've done," she said finally, "but don't mistake room and board for permission to parent my child." "Wasn't trying to." "Good." She heard his chair scrape as he stood. "Mrs. Mercer." She didn't turn around. "That boy's scared, not of me, of everything. He's watching you carry the weight of this whole place on your shoulders, and he doesn't know how to help. Questions are the only tool he's got. Evelyn's hand stilled in the wash basin. You don't know anything about my son. No, ma'am. But I know what it's like to be a boy watching his mother break herself trying to survive. And I know what happens when nobody lets him ask why. The words hit harder than Evelyn wanted to admit. She turned slowly, ready to tell him to mind his own business. But Silas was already heading for the door. Thank you for supper, he said quietly. And then he was gone. Evelyn stood alone in the kitchen, hands dripping, chest tight with anger, and something else she couldn't name. She hated that he was right, hated that a stranger could see through her so easily. But most of all, she hated how badly she wanted someone, anyone, to tell her she was doing okay. The next morning, Silas was waiting by the barn when Evelyn came out to milk the cows. Need to talk to you about the water channel, he said. Evelyn's stomach dropped. She'd been avoiding this conversation, hoping maybe he'd forget or decide it wasn't worth the effort. What about it? If we're going to fix it, we need to start soon. Ground will freeze in 6 weeks, maybe less. After that, we're waiting till spring. I didn't say we were fixing it. Silas looked at her steadily. You didn't say we weren't. Evelyn set down the milk pail harder than necessary. I can't afford to pay you for that kind of work. The chimney was one thing, but digging out a collapsed irrigation line, that's weeks of labor. 3 days if we do it right, maybe 4. Still can't pay you. Still not asking. Why? The question came out sharper than she intended. Why the hell would you do that for nothing? Silas was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. You ever see a dog caught in a trap? The question caught her off guard. What? A dog in a trap. You ever see one? I don't see what that has to do with... Just answer the question. Evelyn crossed her arms. Yeah, I've seen it. What'd you do? Let it out, obviously. Why? Because it was suffering. Even though it wasn't your dog. Even though you didn't put it in the trap? Evelyn saw where this was going and didn't like it one bit. That's different. How? Because I'm not a dog in a trap. No, ma'am. You're a woman with a broken farm and men circling like wolves, waiting for you to quit. That sound better to you? Evelyn felt her face flush with anger. Get off my property. Can't do that. Excuse me? Said I'd fix your chimney, and I did. Now I'm offering to fix your water line. You can say no, but you can't run me off for making the offer. The hell I can't. This is my land. For now. Silas's voice didn't rise, but something in his tone changed. But if you don't fix that irrigation line, it won't be yours much longer. And we both know it. The truth of it hit like a slap. Evelyn wanted to scream at him, wanted to grab the rifle and make him leave, wanted to do anything except stand there and admit he was right. Instead, she picked up the milk pail and headed toward the barn. I'll think about it, she said without looking back. Fair enough. She didn't see him again until that evening, but when she walked past the northern field on her way to collect eggs, she noticed fresh stakes driven into the ground, marking a line from the main channel toward the orchard. He'd already started planning the dig. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle. The chimney wasn't leaking smoke anymore. She could breathe easier, even if she wouldn't admit it out loud. But the water channel was different. Fixing that meant admitting she'd failed, meant accepting help from a stranger, meant trusting someone she barely knew with the one thing that mattered most. And trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Except, what if Silas was telling the truth? What if the men in town really had known about the collapsed line all along? The thought made her sick. She'd gone into Coldwater dozens of times over the past 2 years, asking for help, practically begging for answers. And if they'd known the whole time, if they'd watched her suffer and said nothing. Evelyn threw off the blanket and got out of bed. She couldn't prove it, not without confronting them directly. But there was one person who might tell her the truth. Walter. The old shopkeeper had always been kind to her, even when she couldn't pay her tab on time. He'd known Thomas since they were boys. If anyone in town would be honest with her, it was him. Tomorrow, she decided. Tomorrow she'd go into town and find out. But when tomorrow came, Evelyn found Silas standing in the northern field, shovel in hand, staring down at the ground like he could see straight through to the collapsed pipe below. She walked out to meet him, boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. You planning to dig without permission? She asked. Nope, just measuring. Measuring what? How much I'm going to hate myself in about 4 days. He glanced at her. Clay soil's a son of a bitch to dig through, especially this time of year. Evelyn looked down at the stakes he'd driven into the ground. They formed a perfect line, exactly where she'd dug 2 years ago. How'd you know where to put those? Followed the slope. Water always flows downhill. Your main channel feeds from the creek to the north, runs under this field, and splits off toward the orchard and the western acres. Blockage has to be somewhere along this line, or the whole system would have failed, not just half. He said it like it was simple, like reading land was no different than reading a book. Evelyn felt a strange mix of resentment and admiration. You do this kind of work before? Some. Where? Silas drove another stake into the ground. Here and there. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Evelyn studied him. He wasn't a young man, but he wasn't old either, just worn down in a way that came from hard living rather than hard years. You running from something? She asked. Silas paused, shovel halfway into the ground. Aren't we all? It wasn't a denial, just a deflection. Evelyn should have pushed harder, should have demanded real answers. But the truth was, she didn't want to know. Because if Silas Reed had a past he was running from, asking about it meant risking the chance he'd leave. And she needed him too much to take that risk. If we do this, she said slowly, I need to know you're not going to disappear halfway through and leave me with a trench full of mud. I'll finish what I start. How do I know that? Silas looked at her directly. You don't. But I've been here almost a week, and I haven't stolen anything yet. That's the best proof I can give you. It was a gamble. Everything about this was a gamble, but Evelyn had been gambling since the day Thomas died, betting on one more season, one more harvest, one more miracle. What was one more bet? All right, she said. We'll fix it. But I'm working too. This isn't charity. Didn't think it was. And if you try to cheat me or take advantage, you'll shoot me. I remember. Despite herself, Evelyn almost smiled. Almost. We start tomorrow, she said. Early, before the ground warms up. Silas nodded once. Yes, ma'am. They started digging at dawn. The ground was frozen solid for the first 6 inches, and it took them an hour just to break through. Below that, the clay was dense and wet, sucking at the shovel with every scoop. Evelyn's hands were numb within 20 minutes, but she kept digging. Silas worked beside her without speaking, his breath coming in steady clouds. He moved with the kind of efficiency that came from experience. No wasted motion, no breaks unless absolutely necessary. By mid-morning, they dug down 3 feet. By noon, they'd hit the old clay pipe. There, Silas said, pointing. Evelyn saw it immediately, the jagged crack running along the top of the pipe, right where she remembered it. Whoosee! We need to dig it out completely before we can assess the damage, Silas said. Could take the rest of the day. Evelyn wiped sweat from her face despite the cold. Then we keep digging. They worked until sundown, stopping only when the light got too dim to see clearly. The trench was 6 feet deep now, and roughly 8 feet long. The collapsed section of pipe sat exposed at the bottom, cracked and crumbling. Evelyn climbed out, every muscle screaming in protest. Tomorrow we'll pull out the broken section and replace it, Silas said, examining the damage. You have any spare pipe in the barn? Some. Thomas's grandfather stockpiled materials before he died. Good. We'll need about 6 feet of it, plus fresh mortar to seal the joints. Evelyn nodded, too tired to speak. They walked back to the house in silence, covered in mud and sweat. Caleb met them at the door, eyes wide. You look like you fell in the creek, he said. Feels like it too, Evelyn muttered. That night she could barely lift her arms to eat. Her shoulders burned, her back ached, and her hands were blistered despite the gloves. But when she looked out the kitchen window at the trench glowing faintly in the moonlight, she felt something she hadn't felt in 2 years. Progress. Real, tangible progress. You all right? Silas asked quietly. Evelyn realized she'd been staring out the window for several minutes. Yeah, she said. Just tired. It'll hurt worse tomorrow. I know. They ate in silence. Even Caleb seemed to sense the exhaustion in the room and kept his questions to himself. After supper, Silas stood to leave, but Evelyn stopped him. "Why are you really doing this?" He paused in the doorway. "Told you already. Don't like watching vultures circle." "That's not a reason. That's an excuse." Silas turned to face her. For the first time since he'd arrived, she saw something flicker in his eyes, something raw and unguarded. "Maybe I'm tired of running," he said quietly. "Maybe I needed to fix something that actually matters." Before Evelyn could respond, he was gone. She stood alone in the kitchen, his words echoing in her mind. Maybe I needed to fix something that actually matters. She understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of digging, lifting, and swearing. They pulled out the collapsed section of pipe piece by piece, each chunk heavier than the last. The clay walls kept trying to cave in, forcing them to brace the trench with wooden supports Silas fashioned from old barn planks. Caleb helped where he could, hauling water and tools, keeping watch to make sure the walls held. On the afternoon of the third day, they finally set the new pipe section in place. Silas mixed the mortar while Evelyn held the pipe steady, both of them waist-deep in cold mud. The smell of wet clay and lime filled the air. "Hold it level," Silas said, checking the alignment. "I am holding it level." "Your end's dropping. It's not—" Evelyn adjusted her grip and felt the pipe shift. "Okay, maybe a little." "A little's the difference between water and flooding." They adjusted, readjusted, and adjusted again until the pipe sat perfectly straight. Then Silas began sealing the joints with mortar, working quickly before it could set. Evelyn watched his hands move, precise, confident, sure. "Where'd you learn to do this?" she asked. "My father." It was the first real piece of information he'd volunteered. "He a builder?" "He was a lot of things." Silas smoothed the mortar with his thumb. "None of them very good." Evelyn wanted to ask more, but something in his tone warned her not to push. They worked in silence until the joints were sealed. Then they climbed out of the trench and stood looking down at their work. "Now we wait," Silas said. "Mortar needs 24 hours to cure before we can test it." Evelyn's whole body ached, but she felt lighter than she had in months. "And if it works?" "Then your land stops dying." "And if it doesn't?" Silas looked at her. "Then we try again." The simplicity of it almost made her laugh. Try again. Like it was that easy. Except maybe it was. Maybe survival really was just about getting up one more time than you got knocked down. That night, Evelyn slept better than she had in years. The next morning, they tested the repair. Silas had fashioned a temporary cap for the upstream end of the pipe, so they could fill the line with water and check for leaks. Evelyn stood at the trench, heart pounding, while Caleb hauled buckets from the well. "Ready?" Silas called from upstream. "Ready!" He pulled the cap. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Evelyn heard it, the faint sound of water moving through the pipe. She watched the sealed joint, breath held, waiting for the telltale seep of a failed repair. But the mortar held. Water flowed clean and steady through the new section, disappearing downstream toward the orchard. "It's working," Caleb said, eyes wide. Evelyn didn't trust herself to speak. Silas climbed down into the trench to inspect the joints up close. He checked every inch, looking for cracks, testing the seal with his fingers. Finally, he looked up at Evelyn. "It'll hold." 3 words, but they meant everything. Evelyn felt something break loose in her chest, 2 years of fear and exhaustion and barely held together hope, all releasing at once. She turned away before Silas could see her face, pretending to check something in the distance. "We should start filling in the trench," she said, voice rough. "Yes, ma'am." They spent the rest of the day shoveling dirt back into the hole, packing it down, smoothing it over. By evening, the trench had vanished completely. Only the stakes remained, marking where the repair had been made. Evelyn stood in the field as the sun set, looking at the ground that had nearly destroyed her. Fixed. Finally fixed. "Ma!" Caleb's voice came from the orchard. "Ma, come look." She found him standing by the irrigation ditch that fed the apple trees. Water was flowing through it, real water, clean and steady and strong. For the first time in 2 years, the orchard was getting what it needed. Caleb looked up at her, grinning so wide it hurt to see. "We did it," he said. Evelyn pulled him close, pressing her face against his hair. Yeah, baby, we did. That night at supper, the mood was different. Caleb couldn't stop talking about the water, about how the ditches were flowing, about how green the fields would be next spring. Even Evelyn allowed herself a small smile. Silas ate quietly, as always, but there was something lighter about him, too. Thank you, Evelyn said, when Caleb had gone to bed. Silas looked up from his plate. For what? You know for what. He shrugged. Just fixed a pipe. You fix more than that. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Evelyn asked the question she'd been avoiding for days. What you said about the men in town, about them knowing, was that true? Silas's expression darkened slightly. Every word. How do I prove it? You don't. Not without making enemies you can't afford. I don't care about making enemies. You should. Silas leaned back in his chair. Those men have money and influence. You pick a fight with them, and they'll bury you in ways that have nothing to do with land. So I'm just supposed to let it go. Pretend they didn't try to destroy me. No, you're supposed to survive, and then you make them watch you succeed. The words settled over her like a weight. He was right, damn him. Fighting wouldn't change what they'd done. It would only give them more ammunition to use against her. But surviving, thriving, that was revenge they couldn't touch. All right, she said quietly. I'll survive. Silas nodded once. Good. He stood to leave, but Evelyn stopped him again. How long are you planning to stay? The question hung in the air between them. Silas looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his gray eyes. As long as you'll let me, he said finally. And then he was gone, leaving Evelyn alone in the kitchen with a feeling she didn't have a name for yet, but it felt dangerously close to hope. Winter came early that year, but the farm didn't feel it the way it had before. The western field, which used to flood and freeze into a useless sheet of ice, now drained properly. The orchard trees stood strong, their roots finally getting the water they'd been starved of for 2 years. Even the animals seemed healthier, as if they could sense the change in the land itself. Evelyn noticed it most in the mornings. The sound of water moving through the irrigation channels had become a kind of background music, steady and reassuring. It meant the farm was breathing again. But success brought attention she hadn't wanted. The first visitor arrived on a gray December morning. Evelyn was in the barn mucking stalls when she heard the horse approach. She straightened, pitchfork in hand, and walked to the door. Clayton Harris sat astride a chestnut mare, dressed in his expensive coat with the fur collar. He smiled down at her like they were old friends. Morning, Evelyn. Farm's looking better? She didn't return the smile. What do you want, Clayton? Just being neighborly. Heard you got your irrigation problems sorted out. Word travels fast. Small town. He dismounted and tied his horse to the fence post. Mind if I take a look at what you've done? Always curious about these things. Evelyn tightened her grip on the pitchfork. I do mind, actually. Clayton's smile faltered slightly. Now, Evelyn, there's no need to be unfriendly. You're just checking to see if the land you were hoping to buy cheap is actually worth something now. She kept her voice level. Answer's yes. So you can stop being neighborly and get off my property. His face hardened. That's a hell of a way to talk to someone who's tried to help you. Help? The word came out sharp as glass. You offered to buy my land for a fraction of what it's worth while I was struggling. That's not help, Clayton. That's circling a wounded animal. I made you a fair offer. You made me an insult. They stared at each other across the muddy barnyard. Clayton's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he wanted to spit out but couldn't quite manage. Finally, he untied his horse and swung back into the saddle. You're making a mistake being hostile. People in this town have long memories. So do I, Evelyn said quietly. Clayton rode off without another word. Evelyn watched him go, her heart hammering. She'd just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the county, and part of her knew she should have been more careful. But the larger part of her didn't give a damn. She turned back toward the barn and found Silas standing in the doorway. How much of that did you hear? She asked. Enough. He stepped aside to let her pass. He'll be back. Men like that don't take no for an answer the first time. Let him come back. I'll tell him the same thing. Silas studied her face for a moment. You meant what you said, about not caring if you make enemies. I meant it, even if it costs you. Evelyn set the pitchfork against the wall harder than necessary. I've already lost almost everything, Silas. The only thing I've got left is my pride, and I'm not selling that to men who tried to watch me fail." She expected him to argue, to tell her again that she needed to be smart, to survive. Instead, he just nodded once. "All right then." And somehow, that simple acceptance meant more than any advice could have. Word of the confrontation spread through Coldwater within days. Evelyn felt it the next time she went into town for supplies. The stares were different now, less pitying, more calculating. Women whispered behind gloved hands, men stopped talking when she walked past. At the general store, Walter was restocking shelves when she entered. The old shopkeeper looked up, saw her, and something like relief crossed his weathered face. "Evelyn? Good to see you." "Walter?" She set her basket on the counter. "Need to settle my account." His eyebrows rose. "You sure? I told you there's no rush." "I'm sure." She counted out $18 from the small leather pouch Thomas had given her for their 5th anniversary. It hurt to part with the money, but she couldn't keep taking charity, not when the farm was finally producing again. Walter accepted the payment and made a notation in his ledger. "Heard you had words with Clayton Harris," he said casually, not looking up. "Did you?" "His versions got you threatening him with a pitchfork." "I was holding a pitchfork, didn't threaten him with it." "That's what I figured." Walter closed the ledger and leaned on the counter. "Listen, Evelyn, I know you and I go back a ways, so I'm going to say something I probably shouldn't." She waited. "Clayton's telling people you're unstable. Says grief's made you paranoid and hostile. He's got folks convinced you're going to run that farm into the ground again. And when you do, someone responsible should be ready to step in." The words landed like punches. "Someone responsible," Evelyn repeated quietly. Meaning him and his friends." Walter's voice dropped lower. "They're building a case, Evelyn. Not a legal one, but a social one. Making it so when they do make another move on your land, the whole town will think they're doing you a favor." Evelyn felt cold all over. "And you're telling me this because I'm tired of watching powerful men destroy decent people." Walter met her eyes directly. "And because I knew your husband, and he deserved better than what happened to you after he died." For a moment, Evelyn couldn't speak. "What do you know about what happened to me?" she asked finally. Walter hesitated. Then he glanced toward the door, checking to make sure they were alone. "I know Clayton and his people found your broken irrigation line a year and a half ago. I know they discussed it right here in this store, laughing about how easy the fix would be. And I know they decided to stay quiet and wait for you to break." There it was. Confirmation of what Silas had told her, spoken out loud by someone she'd known for years. Evelyn's hands curled into fists on the counter. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I'm a coward." Walter's voice was bitter. "I told myself it wasn't my business, that you'd figure it out on your own. But the truth is, I was scared of what they'd do to my store if I got involved. And now? Now I'm old enough that I don't care anymore." He pushed a small paper-wrapped package across the counter. "Extra thread and needles, no charge. Considerate payment for 2 years of keeping my mouth shut when I should have spoken up." Evelyn looked at the package, then at Walter's lined face. "I don't want your guilt, Walter. I want the truth. Who else was involved?" He rattled off 3 names, all wealthy ranchers, all men who'd offered their condolences at Thomas's funeral with smiles that hadn't reached their eyes. Evelyn committed the names to memory like stones she'd carry forever. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me, I don't deserve it." Walter straightened, suddenly looking every one of his 70 years. "Just promise me you'll be careful. These men don't play fair." "Neither do I, not anymore." She left the store with her supplies and Walter's warning, both weighing heavy. When she got back to the farm, she found Silas and Caleb working on the eastern fence line. Her son was holding posts steady while Silas hammered them into the half-frozen ground. 3 more and we're done with this section," Silas was saying. "Then we move to Kits." He stopped when he saw Evelyn's face. "What happened?" Walter confirmed it. "Everything you said about Clayton and the others, it's all true." Caleb looked between them, confused. "Confirmed what?" Evelyn hesitated. The boy was only 7. He didn't need to know how ugly people could be. But Silas had been right about one thing. Caleb was going to face trouble whether she protected him from it or not. "Some men in town knew our land was broken and didn't tell us," she said carefully. "They wanted us to fail so they could buy the farm cheap." Caleb's face went pale. Why would they do that? Because people who want things sometimes don't care who they hurt to get them. That's not fair. No, baby, it's not. Caleb looked down at the post he was holding, his small hands tight on the wood. Are they going to try to take our farm? They're going to try. Evelyn knelt down so she was eye level with him. But we're not going to let them. Understand? He nodded, but she could see the fear in his eyes. That night, she lay awake thinking about Walter's warning. Clayton was building a case against her, painting her as unstable, damaged, unfit to run the farm. And when enough people believed it, he'd make his move. She needed to be smarter, needed to show the town that the Mercer farm wasn't failing anymore. It was thriving. The next morning, she found Silas in the barn oiling harness leather. I need your help with something, she said. He looked up. What kind of something? The kind that proves I'm not crazy. She pulled out a piece of paper where she'd been sketching plans. Spring planning's 4 months away. I want to expand the wheat field, add a new section to the orchard, maybe even try corn in the South Acre. Silas studied the sketch. That's ambitious. That's the point. I need this town to see that the farm isn't just surviving, it's growing. Can we do it? Depends. You got money for seed? Some. Not enough for everything, but enough to start. Silas nodded slowly. We'd need to clear the South Acre, prep the soil, build out the irrigation to reach it. That's 2 months of hard work, minimum. Then we start today. He looked at her with something that might have been respect. You're serious about this? Dead serious. All right then. He set down the leather and stood. But we do it right. No cutting corners, no rushing. Good farming takes time. I know. They started that afternoon. The South Acre had been sitting unused for 3 years, overgrown with wild grass and scrub brush. Clearing it was backbreaking work that left Evelyn's hands blistered and her shoulders screaming. But she kept going. Caleb helped where he could, dragging brush to the burn pile, gathering rocks that would break plow blades if left in the soil. And Silas worked like a man possessed, swinging an axe with mechanical precision, cutting through roots that had been growing undisturbed for years. By the end of the first week, they'd cleared 1/4 of the acre. By the end of the second, half. And somewhere in the middle of the third week, Evelyn realized she wasn't just working to prove something to the town anymore. She was working because it felt good. The physical exhaustion, the visible progress, the way the land responded to their efforts, it reminded her of why she'd loved farming in the first place. Thomas used to say that land was honest. It gave back what you put into it. Nothing more, nothing less. She'd forgotten that. But now, standing in the middle of the half-cleared South Acre with dirt under her nails and sweat on her face, she remembered. One evening in late January, they were sitting on the porch after supper when Caleb asked the question he'd been holding back for weeks. Is Silas going to stay forever? Evelyn glanced at Silas, who was carving a piece of wood into something that looked like it might become a whistle. That's up to him, she said carefully. Caleb turned to Silas. Are you? Silas kept carving, his face unreadable in the fading light. Don't know yet. But you like it here, right? It's all right. Just all right? Caleb, Evelyn warned. But Silas set down his knife and looked at the boy directly. I like it fine, he said quietly. But liking a place and staying in a place aren't always the same thing. Why not? Because sometimes people have reasons to keep moving that don't have anything to do with where they are. Caleb frowned, trying to work through the logic. That doesn't make sense. It will when you're older. The boy looked dissatisfied with that answer, but he didn't push. After Caleb went inside to get ready for bed, Evelyn spoke. You planning to leave? Silas picked up his knife again. Everybody leaves eventually. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. Evelyn studied his profile in the twilight. He'd been with them for almost 3 months now, and she still knew almost nothing about him. Where he came from, what he was running from, why he'd shown up in cold water in the first place. You know what I think? She said. What? I think you're scared. His hand stilled on the wood. Of what? Of staying. Of putting down roots, of caring about something enough that it could hurt when you lose it. Silas didn't respond. I get it, Evelyn continued. I've been scared too. Scared of trusting people, scared of asking for help, scared of admitting I couldn't do everything alone. But being scared doesn't make the fear go away. It just makes you tired. Is there a point to this? Yeah, the point is you don't have to keep running. She stood up, brushing off her skirt. You've got a place here as long as you want it. No strings, no expectations. Just a place. She went inside before he could answer, leaving him alone on the porch with his half-carved whistle and his thoughts. The next morning, Silas was gone. Evelyn found his blanket folded neatly on the hay bale he'd been using as a bed, his few possessions packed and vanished. For one terrible moment, she thought he'd left for good. Then she heard the sound of an axe biting into wood from the direction of the south acre. She found him there, already working, like the conversation from the night before had never happened. But when he saw her, he stopped. Figured we should get this acre finished before the ground thaws, he said. Makes plowing easier. Evelyn crossed her arms. That's your excuse for being out here at dawn? It's not an excuse, it's a reason. Same thing. Not really. Despite herself, Evelyn smiled. You steal my lines now? Seemed fair, considering you stole my peace and quiet. It was the closest thing to a joke she'd ever heard him make. They worked side by side until noon, and neither of them mentioned the conversation from the night before. But something had shifted between them, something neither of them was quite ready to name yet. February brought bitter cold and 2 feet of snow. The farm went quiet under the blanket of white. Animals stayed in the barn. The fields disappeared beneath drifts. Even the sound of the irrigation channels was muffled and distant. Evelyn used the forced stillness to plan. She sat at the kitchen table with ledgers and seed catalogs spread out, calculating costs and yields, trying to figure out how to maximize every inch of land they'd cleared. Silas helped, offering suggestions based on soil types and drainage patterns she hadn't considered. And Caleb sat between them, asking questions, learning. It felt almost normal, like a family. The thought terrified Evelyn more than she wanted to admit, because families could be broken. She'd learned that lesson when Thomas died, and if she let herself think of Silas as something more than hired help, if she let Caleb get too attached. What happened when he finally did leave? She pushed the thought away and focused on the numbers in front of her, one disaster at a time. In mid-February, Walter showed up at the farm. Evelyn saw him coming up the road and met him at the gate, surprised. Walter? Everything all right? The old shopkeeper looked nervous. He kept glancing back toward town like he was worried someone had followed him. Need to talk to you. Inside, if that's all right. They sat in the kitchen while Evelyn poured coffee. Silas was in the barn, and Caleb was upstairs doing lessons, so they were alone. What's this about? Evelyn asked. Walter wrapped his hands around the mug like he needed the warmth. Clayton's making his move. Evelyn's stomach dropped. What kind of move? He's filed a claim with the county. Says your farm's been neglecting its water rights, letting runoff contaminate downstream properties. He's demanding an inspection. That's insane. The irrigation's been fixed for months. There's no contamination. I know that and you know that, but Clayton's got 3 other ranchers backing his claim, and they're all saying their wells have gone bad since your repairs. Evelyn felt like she'd been slapped. They're lying. Of course they're lying. But they've got money and lawyers, and you've got... He gestured around the modest kitchen. This. So what happens now? County inspector comes out next week. If he finds evidence of contamination, they can force you to tear out the whole irrigation system and redo it under supervision. That'll cost more than you've got. And if he doesn't find contamination, Walter's face was grim. Then they'll find something else. They're not going to stop, Evelyn. They want your land, and they're going to keep pushing until you break or sell. Evelyn set down her coffee cup with shaking hands. Let them push. You're not hearing me. I'm hearing you fine, Walter. But I'm not selling. Not to Clayton, not to anyone. She met his eyes. They want to fight. They've got one. Walter looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You're as stubborn as your husband was. I'm going to take that as a compliment. It wasn't meant as one. But there was affection in his voice. Just be careful. These men play dirty. After Walter left, Evelyn sat alone in the kitchen, trying to control the panic rising in her chest. An inspection. Even if the inspector was honest, and there was no guarantee of that, he'd be looking for problems. And farms always had problems. A crack in a pipe, a leak in a joint. Anything could be twisted into evidence of negligence. She needed help. But who could she trust? The door opened and Silas came in, stomping snow off his boots. Saw Walter leaving. What do you want? Evelyn told him everything. Silas listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. They're smart, he said finally. Going after your water rights means going after the thing that was broken in the first place. Makes their story more believable. Can we fight it? Depends on the inspector. If he's honest, we've got nothing to worry about, but if Clayton's already paid him off, he shrugged, then it doesn't matter what we do. So we just wait and hope? No. Silas stood and grabbed his coat. We make damn sure there's nothing to find. They spent the next 3 days inspecting every inch of the irrigation system. They checked joints, tested water flow, looked for leaks that didn't exist. They cleared drainage ditches, reinforced weak sections of pipe, double-checked the mortar seals on the repair they'd made. By the time they finished, the irrigation system was in better shape than it had been in 20 years. But Evelyn still couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't be enough. The inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning. His name was Mills, a thin man in his 50s with ink-stained fingers and a permanent squint. He carried a leather case full of testing equipment and a notebook where he wrote everything down in tiny, precise handwriting. Clayton Harris arrived with him, along with 2 other ranchers Evelyn recognized from Walter's list. Mrs. Mercer, Clayton said with false warmth, thank you for cooperating with this inspection. Didn't have much choice, Evelyn said flatly. Mills cleared his throat. I'll need access to your irrigation channels, your well, and any downstream drainage points. This shouldn't take more than a few hours. Fine, but I'm coming with you. That's not, I'm coming with you, Evelyn repeated. This is my land, and I have a right to see what you're testing and where. Mills glanced at Clayton, who nodded slightly. Very well. They started at the main channel where Mills took water samples and measured flow rates. Then they moved to the orchard, the western field, the drainage ditches. Everywhere they went, Evelyn watched like a hawk, making sure Mills didn't plant evidence or manufacture problems. Silas followed at a distance, saying nothing but missing nothing. After 3 hours, Mills had filled half his notebook with observations and collected a dozen water samples in glass vials. I'll need to send these to the county lab for analysis, he said. Results will take about a week. And in the meantime, Evelyn asked, in the meantime, you continue normal operations. If there's a problem, the lab will find it. Clayton stepped forward. And if there is contamination, what's the remedy? Depends on the source and severity. Could be anything from a simple fix to a complete system overhaul. The way he said it made Evelyn's skin crawl. After they left, she stood in the yard feeling like she'd just been robbed at gunpoint. Silas came to stand beside her. Think he's honest? She asked. Don't know, but he did the tests by the book, far as I could tell. That's something. Not enough. No, but it's what we've got. They walked back to the house in silence. That night, Evelyn couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, could only sit at the kitchen table staring at the ledger and trying to figure out how she'd pay for a system overhaul if it came to that. The answer was simple. She couldn't. If they forced her to rebuild the irrigation, she'd have to sell the land to pay for it, which was exactly what they wanted. Ma? She looked up. Caleb stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, eyes heavy with sleep. What are you doing up? Heard you moving around. He came over and leaned against her chair. Are we going to lose the farm? Evelyn pulled him close. No, baby, we're not. Promise? She wanted to promise, wanted to lie and tell him everything would be fine, but she'd learned the hard way that promises meant nothing when the world decided to break them. I'm going to fight as hard as I can, she said instead. That's all I can promise. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that nearly broke her. Papa would be proud of you. Evelyn pressed her face against his hair, eyes burning. Go back to bed, she whispered. After he left, she sat alone in the dark kitchen, Thomas's ghost sitting heavy in the empty chair across from her. Would he be proud? Or would he think she was being reckless, stubborn, prideful? She'd never know. All she could do was keep fighting, and hope it was enough. The week waiting for the test results felt like holding her breath underwater. Evelyn went through the motions of daily work, feeding animals, mending fences, planning spring planting, but her mind was always half somewhere else, calculating worst-case scenarios. Silas noticed, but said nothing. He just kept working, his steady presence the only thing that kept her from spiraling completely. On the 5th day, Caleb came running from the road. Ma, someone's coming! Evelyn's heart jumped into her throat. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the front of the house, steeling herself for whatever news Mills was bringing. But it wasn't the inspector. It was a wagon she didn't recognize, driven by a woman in a dark blue dress. The wagon pulled up and the woman climbed down carefully. She was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that looked like they didn't miss much. Mrs. Mercer? That's me. My name is Ruth Calloway. I own the property 3 miles east of here. She gestured vaguely in that direction. Mind if we talk? Evelyn had heard the name but never met the woman. Ruth Calloway was a widow like herself, ran a cattle operation that was supposedly one of the most successful in the region. What about? Clayton Harris and his inspection. Ruth's voice was matter-of-fact. I heard what he's trying to do to you, and I thought you should know something. Evelyn's guard went up immediately. What's that? He tried the same thing with me 4 years ago. Different excuse, same goal, forced me to spend money I didn't have, so I'd be desperate enough to sell. What happened? I called his bluff. Ruth pulled a folded paper from her pocket. Had my own water tested by an independent lab, not the county. When my results came back clean and his inspector's results came back contaminated, I threatened to take the discrepancy to the state board. He dropped the whole thing within a week. She held out the paper. It was the name and address of a testing laboratory in the next county over. Get your water tested here, Ruth said. Do it before Mills gives you his results. That way, if his numbers don't match yours, you've got proof he's lying. Evelyn took the paper, stunned. Why are you helping me? Because I'm tired of men like Clayton Harris thinking they can bully women into giving up what's theirs. Ruth climbed back into her wagon. Also because your husband once helped me pull a calf that was breech. Never got to thank him properly before he passed. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Just get your water tested. Ruth picked up the reins. And Mrs. Mercer, when you win this fight, and you will, don't let them see you celebrate. Men like that can't stand being beaten by someone they underestimated. Makes them dangerous. She drove off, leaving Evelyn standing in the yard holding a piece of paper that might be the only weapon she had. Silas appeared from the barn. Who was that? Someone who just gave us a fighting chance. That afternoon, Evelyn rode into the next county with water samples from every part of her irrigation system. The laboratory was a small building attached to the back of a druggist shop, run by a serious young man who treated each sample like it contained secrets. Results in 3 days, he told her. Sooner if you pay extra. How much extra? $2. Evelyn thought of the $43 she'd started with, now down to $27 after settling debts and buying supplies. I'll pay it. She rode home as the sun was setting, hoping she'd just made the right gamble. 2 days later, Mills returned. He arrived alone this time, without Clayton or the other ranchers. That alone made Evelyn nervous. Mrs. Mercer? He tipped his hat. Got your test results back from the county lab. And? He pulled out his notebook, flipping to a marked page. Found elevated sediment levels in 3 of the 12 samples. Not enough to constitute a health hazard, but enough to indicate improper drainage management. Evelyn's blood ran cold. That's impossible. We checked every drainage point. There's no sediment buildup anywhere. I'm just reporting what the lab found. Mills's voice was professionally neutral. The county's recommendation is that you install filtration systems at each major drainage point and submit to quarterly monitoring for the next 2 years. How much would that cost? Filtration systems run about $30 each. You'd need 4, maybe 5, plus the monitoring fees. Call it another $20 per quarter. Evelyn did the math in her head. Nearly $200 up front, plus ongoing costs she couldn't sustain. It was a death sentence disguised as a safety measure. And if I refuse? Mills looked uncomfortable for the first time. Then the county can place a lien on your property until the work is completed. If the lien isn't satisfied within 6 months, the property goes to auction. There it was, the trap, sprung perfectly. Evelyn felt like she was falling, the ground dropping out from under her feet. I need to see the actual lab results, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Not just your notes, the official documentation. Mills hesitated. That's unusual. I don't care. This is my land and my livelihood. I have a right to see the data that's threatening both. I'll have to request them from the county office. Could take a few days. Then you do that. Evelyn crossed her arms. And until I see those results with my own eyes, I'm not installing anything. Mills closed his notebook with a snap. Mrs. Mercer, I understand you're upset, but fighting this will only make things harder. The county has procedures. So do I. And mine include not taking anyone's word at face value. She stepped aside. You know where the road is. After he left, Evelyn sat on the porch steps, hands shaking. She'd just bought herself a few days. Maybe a week if she was lucky. But unless her independent lab results were clean, and unless she could prove Mills was lying, none of it would matter. The next morning, she rode back to the laboratory. The young man behind the counter looked up as she entered, recognition crossing his face. Mrs. Mercer, your results came in last night. He pulled out a folder. I was going to send them by post, but since you're here, he laid out 4 sheets of paper covered in numbers and technical language Evelyn barely understood. But the summary at the bottom was crystal clear. All samples tested clean, no contamination, no elevated sediment, no drainage issues whatsoever. Evelyn read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't imagining things. This is accurate? She asked. Yes, ma'am. I ran each sample twice to be certain. Your water quality is actually better than most farms in the region. She wanted to cry with relief. Instead, she carefully folded the papers and tucked them in her coat. Thank you. Back at the farm, she found Silas repairing a section of fence near the road. We've got proof, she said, handing him the lab results. He read through them slowly, his expression unreadable. This is good, but it's not over. I know. Mills will say the county lab is more authoritative than some private laboratory. Clayton will back him up. It'll be my word against theirs. So we need more than your word. Silas folded the papers and handed them back. We need witnesses. People who'll testify that your water is clean and your farm isn't contaminating anything. Who's going to do that? Everyone in town either works for Clayton or is too scared to cross him. Silas thought for a moment. What about the woman who came by? Ruth Calloway. She already went against him once. One person isn't enough. Then we find more. But finding allies turned out to be harder than Evelyn expected. She spent the next 2 days riding to neighboring farms, explaining the situation, asking if anyone would be willing to test their own water to prove her farm wasn't the source of contamination. Most said no immediately. A few were sympathetic but claimed they couldn't afford to get involved. One old farmer told her flat out that going against Clayton Harris was suicide, and he wasn't interested in dying for someone else's fight. By the 3rd day, Evelyn was ready to give up. Then Walter showed up at the farm again. Heard you've been asking around for help, he said without preamble. Word travels fast. In Coldwater? Always. He pulled out a piece of paper. Got you 5 names. People who've agreed to have their water tested if you pay for it. They're all downstream from your property, so if your farm was really contaminating things, their wells would show it. Evelyn stared at the list. She recognized 3 of the names, small farmers, people who'd never had much but had always been decent. Why would they agree to this? Walter smiled grimly. Because Clayton Harris has bullied every single one of them at some point. They might be too scared to testify, but they're not too scared to hand you ammunition. How much will the testing cost? 5 samples at the rush rate, $10. It was money she didn't have, but she also didn't have a choice. I'll get you the money by tomorrow. That night, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table counting what was left of her savings. $27. If she paid for the testing, she'd have 17 left. Not enough for spring seed, not enough for emergencies, barely enough to feed them through the month if something went wrong. But if she didn't pay for the testing, she'd lose everything anyway. She was still sitting there when Silas came in for supper. He took one look at her face and the money spread across the table. What's the damage? $10 for water testing. Walter found people downstream who'll let us use their wells as proof. That's good. It's expensive. Silas pulled something from his pocket and set it on the table. It was a small leather pouch, the kind men carried their wages in. What's this? Evelyn asked. $15. All I've got saved. Use it. She stared at the pouch like it might bite her. I can't take your money. You're not taking it. I'm giving it. Silas, yep. This farm matters, he said quietly. Not just to you, to Caleb, to me. He pushed the pouch closer. Let me help. Evelyn felt something crack open in her chest. She'd been alone for so long, carrying everything by herself, that she'd forgotten what it felt like when someone genuinely wanted to share the weight. "I'll pay you back," she said, voice rough. "I know." She took the pouch. The next day, she gave Walter the money, and he arranged for the testing. 3 days later, the results came back. All 5 wells tested clean. No contamination, no sediment, no issues at all. Evelyn now had 6 independent lab reports, her own plus the 5 downstream properties, all proving that her farm wasn't the problem. She brought everything to Mills when he returned with the official county results. "These are from a private lab," Mills said dismissively. "The county doesn't accept—" "6 different labs," Evelyn interrupted. "6 different properties, all saying the same thing. My water is clean. So either every one of these labs is wrong, or your county lab is." Mills' face tightened. "Mrs. Mercer, I understand you're frustrated, but I'm not frustrated. I'm being railroaded." She spread the reports across his notebook. "You found contamination that doesn't exist. Why?" "I found what the lab reported." "Then the lab's lying." "That's a serious accusation." "It's a serious situation." Evelyn leaned forward. "I want the names of everyone who handled my samples at the county lab. I want chain of custody documentation. And I want to know exactly who requested this inspection in the first place, because I'm betting it wasn't a concerned citizen." Mills gathered up his papers, face flushed. "I'll relay your concerns to the county office. You do that, and tell them I'm filing a formal complaint about the testing procedure. If they want to put a lien on my property, they better be prepared to defend their science in front of a state board." It was a bluff. She had no idea how to file a complaint or appeal to a state board. But Mills didn't know that. He left looking significantly less confident than when he'd arrived. After he was gone, Evelyn sat on the porch steps, adrenaline making her hands shake. Silas came to sit beside her. "Think you scared him?" "I think I bought us time." "Maybe." "That's more than we had yesterday." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink toward the hills. "Can I ask you something?" Evelyn said. "Sure." "Why are you really here?" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I had a farm once, in Missouri. Not as big as this, but it was mine." Evelyn waited. "Had a wife too, Sarah. She died giving birth to our daughter. Baby didn't make it either." The words were flat, emotionless, but Evelyn could hear the weight behind them. "After that, I couldn't stay. Sold the place for half what it was worth and just started moving. Told myself I was looking for work, but really, I was just running." "From what?" "From being the kind of man who let his family down." He picked up a piece of gravel and turned it over in his fingers. "Sarah wanted that farm, wanted the life we were building, and when she died, it felt like everything I'd built was a lie. That's not your fault. I know, but knowing something and feeling it are different things." He tossed the gravel into the yard. "Anyway, I've been drifting for 6 years now, working places, fixing things, moving on before I could care too much. And then I rode into Coldwater and heard those men talking about you." And I saw a woman fighting for the exact thing I'd given up without a fight." He looked at her. "Made me angry. At them for trying to take it. At myself for letting go of mine so easy." Evelyn's throat was tight. "So you stayed to fix your guilt?" "Maybe at first. But that's not why I'm still here." "Then why?" Silas stood up, brushing off his pants. "Because this place feels like something worth fighting for, and I'm tired of running from things that matter." He walked back to the barn before she could respond. Evelyn sat alone on the porch as darkness fell, his words echoing in her mind. This place feels like something worth fighting for. She'd been so focused on survival, on proving she could handle everything alone, that she'd stopped seeing the farm as anything except a burden to carry. But Silas saw it differently. He saw potential, purpose, home. And somehow, his belief in it made her believe again, too. That night, for the first time in months, Evelyn slept soundly. The next week brought an unexpected visitor. Ruth Calloway returned, this time with a man Evelyn didn't recognize, tall, well-dressed, carrying a leather briefcase. "Mrs. Mercer," Ruth said, "this is Daniel Morrison. He's a lawyer from the state capitol." Evelyn's stomach dropped. "I can't afford a lawyer." "You're not paying. Morrison said. Mrs. Calloway is retaining me on your behalf. Why would you do that? Evelyn asked Ruth. Because I'm tired of watching Clayton Harris destroy people. Ruth's voice was steel. And because I've got more money than I need and a grudge that needs settling. Consider it an investment in making his life difficult. Morrison set his briefcase on the porch railing and pulled out a folder. I've reviewed the documentation you provided Mrs. Calloway, the independent lab results, the county's findings, the inspection reports. There are significant irregularities. Irregularities like what? Like the fact that the county lab that tested your samples has received 3 formal complaints in the past 2 years for inaccurate results. Like the fact that Clayton Harris sits on the county water board and has direct oversight of the inspection process. Like the fact that this is the 4th time he's used contamination claims to pressure property owners in this region. Evelyn felt hope flare in her chest for the first time in weeks. Can you stop him? I can make it expensive and public for him to continue. Morrison pulled out more papers. I'm filing a motion to halt any enforcement action until a state-level review of the testing procedures is completed. That'll take at least 3 months, probably longer. It also means his inspection results become public record, which he won't like. What do I need to do? Nothing. Just keep running your farm and let me handle the legal warfare. Morrison smiled slightly. Men like Clayton are used to winning because people can't afford to fight back. Once they realize you can, they usually fold. And if he doesn't fold? Then we take it to court and I tear apart his entire case in front of a judge. Either way, you win. After they left, Evelyn stood in the yard feeling like she'd just been handed a weapon she hadn't known existed. A real weapon. Not just hope or determination, but actual legal power backed by someone with the resources to use it. Silas came to stand beside her. Things just got interesting, he said. Things just got winnable. The legal motion hit like a bomb. Within 2 days, everyone in Coldwater knew that Evelyn Mercer had lawyered up with someone from the state capitol. That she was fighting back, that she wasn't backing down. The reactions were mixed. Some people avoided her completely, like failure might be contagious. Others, mostly women and small farmers, started treating her differently, not quite friendly, but respectful, like she'd done something they wished they had the courage to do themselves. And Clayton Harris stopped visiting, but his silence felt more dangerous than his threats. He's planning something, Silas said one evening. They were in the barn, checking on a cow that was close to calving. The animal paced restlessly, uncomfortable, but not in labor yet. How do you know? Evelyn asked. Because men like him don't walk away just because they got their hand slapped. They regroup. Let him plan. Morrison says we're protected by the court motion. Morrison's protecting you legally. Doesn't mean Clayton won't find other ways to make your life hell. Silas was right, but Evelyn was too tired to worry about what Clayton might do next. She had spring planting to plan, animals to care for, and a 7-year-old who was growing out of his clothes faster than she could patch them. One crisis at a time, March arrived with warming temperatures and the first signs of thaw. The irrigation channels, properly repaired and functioning, began flowing again. The fields that had been locked in ice started to soften. The orchard trees showed the first hints of bud swell. It was time to plant. Evelyn and Silas spent 2 weeks preparing the soil, turning over the fields with the old plow horse, breaking up clods, removing rocks. Caleb worked alongside them when he wasn't doing lessons, his small hands learning the rhythm of farm work the way his fathers had before him. And slowly, painfully, the farm came back to life. One warm afternoon in late March, Evelyn was walking the property line when she noticed something strange. Fresh stakes driven into the ground along her eastern border. Survey stakes. Her blood went cold. She followed the line of stakes and found a man she didn't recognize measuring distances with a long chain. "What are you doing on my land?" she called. The man looked up, startled. "I'm with the county surveyor's office. We're verifying property boundaries for who?" "I'm not at liberty to say, ma'am." Evelyn marched over and grabbed one of the stakes, pulling it out of the ground. "Get off my property, now!" "Ma'am, I have legal authorization. I don't care what you have. This is my land, and you're trespassing." The surveyor backed away, hands raised. "I'll need to report this to report it to whoever you want. But if I see you here again without my written permission, I'm calling the sheriff." She watched him pack up his equipment and leave, her heart hammering. When she got back to the house, she found Silas waiting. "Someone's surveying the eastern border," she said. "They wouldn't tell me who authorized it." Silas's face went dark. "Clayton, has to be." "But why?" "The court motion stopped his contamination claim. Because he's looking for another angle." Silas grabbed his coat. "I'm riding into town. Don't wait supper for me." He was gone before Evelyn could ask where he was going. She spent the rest of the afternoon anxious and distracted, watching the road for his return. He finally came back just after dark, looking grim. "Clayton filed a boundary dispute," he said. "Claims your eastern property line was surveyed incorrectly decades ago and that 5 acres of what you think is your land actually belongs to him." Evelyn felt the ground shift under her feet again. "That's insane. Thomas's family has owned this land for 3 generations. The boundaries are clear. Maybe. But proving it means finding the original survey documents, which are probably buried in some county archive. And while you're searching for them, Clayton's filing for an emergency injunction to prevent you from working those 5 acres until the dispute is resolved. Those 5 acres include half the orchard." "I know." Evelyn wanted to scream. Every time she knocked down one of Clayton's attacks, he came at her from a different direction. It was like fighting smoke. "What do I do?" "Call Morrison. Tonight. This is exactly the kind of legal trick he needs to know about." Evelyn rode into town and used the telegraph office to send a message to Morrison's office in the capital. The response came back within an hour. "Will file, counter motion. Stop. Need original property. Deed stop. Send immediately." Evelyn rode home and tore apart every drawer, every box, every corner of the house looking for the deed. She found it finally in an old trunk in the attic, yellowed paper, barely legible, but still legal. She sent it by post the next morning, paying extra for speed. And then she waited. Again. Always waiting. 2 weeks later, Morrison sent word that the boundary dispute had been dismissed. The original deed was clear, the survey was accurate, and Clayton had no legal claim to her land. But the damage was done. Between the contamination fight and the boundary dispute, Evelyn had lost a month of planting time. The fields that should have been seeded in early March were still empty in mid-April. She was behind, badly behind, and there was no way to catch up. "We plant anyway," Silas said when she voiced her fears. "Late planting is better than no planting." So they planted. Working dawn to dusk, they got seed in the ground, wheat in the western field, corn in the south acre, vegetables in the kitchen garden. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't on time, but it was something. And sometimes, something was all you could manage. One evening in late April, Evelyn was sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Silas came to sit beside her. They'd fallen into this routine over the past months, quiet moments at the end of hard days, neither of them needing to fill the silence with words. But tonight, Silas broke it. "Been thinking about something," he said. "What's that?" "This farm needs more than 2 people to run it properly. Even with Caleb helping, we're spread too thin. Can't afford to hire help. Not talking about hiring." He turned to look at her directly. "Talking about making it official." Evelyn's heart skipped. "Official how?" Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out something small wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a ring. Simple iron, worn smooth with age. "It was my mother's," he said quietly. "Only thing of value she ever owned. She gave it to me before she died, told me to give it to someone who deserved it." Evelyn couldn't breathe. "Silas, I'm not good with words, never have been. But I know this." He gestured at the farm around them. "This place matters. You matter. Caleb matters. And I'm tired of pretending I'm just passing through." He held out the ring. "Marry me, Evelyn. Not because you need help with the farm, and not because I'm trying to fix my past. Marry me because somewhere between fixing that damn irrigation line and fighting off vultures, I fell in love with you." The world narrowed to the ring in his hand and the raw honesty in his eyes. Evelyn had spent 2 years convinced she'd never feel this way again, that the part of her capable of love had died with Thomas. But she'd been wrong. "Yes," she said, voice breaking. Silas slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. They told Caleb the next morning over breakfast. The boy looked between them, processing, his face unreadable in that way children have when they're trying to figure out if something is good news or complicated news. "So Silas is going to be my new father?" he asked finally. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Silas. "Not replacing your father," she said carefully. "Nobody could do that. But yes, Silas will be part of our family." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, pushing eggs around his plate. Then he looked at Silas. "Does this mean you're not leaving?" "That's exactly what it means." "Promise?" Silas held out his hand. "Promise." Caleb shook it solemnly, like they were sealing a business deal. Then he went back to eating his breakfast like nothing world-changing had just happened. But Evelyn saw the small smile he was trying to hide, and her heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. They planned a simple wedding for early June, after the planting was finished but before harvest season began. Nothing fancy, just Walter as witness, and maybe Ruth Calloway if she'd come. But news traveled in Coldwater the way it always did, and within days everyone knew that the widow Mercer was marrying the drifter who'd fixed her farm. The reactions were predictable. Some women clucked their tongues and said it was too soon, that she should have waited longer out of respect for Thomas's memory. Others whispered that she was desperate, marrying the first man who showed her kindness. And a few, a very few, said quietly that maybe she deserved to be happy again. Evelyn ignored all of it. She'd learned that people would judge her no matter what she did. Might as well give them something worth talking about. Spring turned to early summer, and the late-planted crops began to show. The wheat came up thin but steady. The corn sprouted in uneven rows. The kitchen garden exploded with vegetables that Evelyn canned and preserved for winter. It wasn't the harvest she'd hoped for, but it was enough. And enough felt like a victory after 2 years of nothing. One afternoon in mid-May, Clayton Harris rode past the farm. He didn't stop, didn't even slow down. Just rode past on his expensive horse, staring at the green fields like they personally offended him. Evelyn was in the yard hanging laundry when she saw him. She stopped, clothespin in hand, and met his gaze head-on. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the fence line. Then Clayton spurred his horse and rode off. Silas came to stand beside her, watching the dust settle on the road. "He's not done," he said. "I know. But he's losing, and he knows it too." Evelyn hung the last sheet on the line. "Good." The week before the wedding, Morrison sent word that the state review of the county water testing procedures had been completed. The findings were damning. The lab had falsified results on at least 7 cases over the past 3 years, all involving property disputes where Clayton Harris or his associates had financial interest. The lab director had been fired, 2 technicians were under investigation, and the county was facing a lawsuit from 4 different property owners. Clayton Harris had resigned from the water board. "It's over," Morrison wrote in his letter. "They can't touch you now." Evelyn read the letter 3 times, waiting for the relief to hit. When it finally did, it came as tears she couldn't quite explain. Not tears of joy exactly, more like the release of 2 years of pressure she'd been holding inside. Silas found her sitting at the kitchen table, letter in hand, crying quietly. He didn't say anything, just pulled up a chair and sat with her until the tears stopped. "Sorry," she said finally, wiping her face. "Don't know why I'm crying. This is good news." "It's good news that came at the cost of 2 years of your life," Silas said quietly. "You're allowed to be angry about that." "I'm not angry. She struggled for the word. "I'm tired. Tired of fighting, tired of having to prove I deserve what's mine." "I know." "Do you?" She looked at him. "Because you chose this. You chose to stay and fight. I didn't have a choice. This is my life." "You had a choice," Silas said. "You could have sold, could have walked away. Plenty of people would have." "That's not a real choice. It's the one most people take." He reached across the table and took her hand. "You fought because you're stubborn and proud, and you don't know how to quit. And those are exactly the things I love about you." Despite herself, Evelyn smiled. "Stubborn and proud. That's what you're marrying?" "That's exactly what I'm marrying." They were married on the first Saturday in June. The ceremony was held in the front room of the farmhouse, too small for a crowd, which was fine because there wasn't a crowd to invite. Walter stood as witness, dressed in his Sunday best. Ruth Calloway came, bringing a cake she'd baked herself. A handful of neighbors showed up. The small farmers who'd let Evelyn use their wells for testing. People who understood what it meant to fight for land you loved. The preacher from Coldwater performed the ceremony in 10 minutes flat, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation, but professional enough to hide it. When he pronounced them married, Silas kissed Evelyn like they were the only two people in the room. Caleb cheered, Walter clapped, and Ruth muttered, "About damn time." The small gathering ate cake and drank coffee, talking about crops and weather and carefully avoiding any mention of Clayton Harris or legal battles. It felt normal, almost peaceful. As the sun started to set, the guests drifted away, leaving the three of them alone in the farmhouse that now belonged to all of them equally. Caleb fell asleep early, exhausted from excitement. Evelyn and Silas sat on the porch in the warm evening air, watching fireflies blink in the orchard. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Evelyn said. "What's that?" "The day you showed up. How suspicious I was, how close I came to running you off." "You had every right to be suspicious." "But if I'd told you to leave and never come back." She shook her head. "Everything would be different." "Maybe. Or maybe you would have figured it out on your own." "I don't think so. I was barely holding on, Silas. Another month and I would have broken." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." She turned to look at him. "I was drowning, and you threw me a rope. That's the truth." Silas was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm glad I showed up when I did." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when two people have been through hell together and come out the other side. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "What do you think happens now?" "Now we farm, raise crops, fix things that break, survive the winters." Sounds boring. Sounds perfect. And somehow it did. Summer brought the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the fields. The late-planted wheat struggled but survived. The corn grew tall and strong. The orchard produced apples, not the massive harvest Evelyn had dreamed of, but enough to sell at market and still have plenty for canning. By August, it was clear that the Mercer farm wasn't just surviving anymore. It was thriving. The irrigation system Silas had repaired worked flawlessly. Water flowed to every corner of the property exactly as it should. The fields that had been drowning or dying for 2 years were now producing crops that made people stop and stare. Buyers started showing up at the farm, offering good prices for wheat and apples. Word spread that Evelyn Mercer's land was back, and the people who'd written her off as a lost cause suddenly found reasons to be friendly again. Evelyn accepted their business, but not their friendship. She remembered who'd helped when she needed it, and who'd stayed silent while others tried to destroy her. Some things couldn't be forgiven with a smile and a handshake. One hot afternoon in late August, a wagon pulled up carrying 3 young men looking for work. "Heard you might need harvest help," the oldest one said. He was maybe 19, sunburned and rail-thin. "We work cheap and we work hard." Evelyn looked at Silas. They'd been talking about hiring help for the harvest. The wheat alone would take 2 weeks to cut and thresh, and they couldn't do it alone. But trusting strangers after everything that had happened felt risky. "Where are you boys from?" Silas asked. "Kansas originally. Been traveling looking for work since the drought hit our family's place." Something in the way he said it reminded Evelyn of herself 2 years ago, desperate but trying not to show it. "Pays $1 a day plus meals," she heard herself say. "You sleep in the barn and you don't touch anything that's not yours. Understood?" "Yes, ma'am." "And if I catch you stealing or causing trouble, you're gone. No second chances." "We're not here to cause trouble, just here to work." They hired the 3 boys and put them to work immediately. To Evelyn's surprise, they were exactly what they'd promised. Hard workers who kept their heads down and did what they were told. By mid-September, the wheat was harvested and sold, bringing in more money than the farm had seen in 3 years. The apples came next, crates and crates of them, sold to merchants from 3 counties over. And slowly, painfully, the financial hole Evelyn had been living in started to fill. She paid off her remaining debt at the general store, put money aside for winter supplies, even managed to buy Caleb new boots that actually fit instead of being stuffed with cloth. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. And after 2 years of barely surviving, stability felt like luxury. One October evening, Evelyn was going through the ledger when she realized something that made her stop cold. They'd made enough to cover all expenses for the year, pay the hired help, save for spring seed, and still have money left over. Actual profit. She stared at the numbers, not quite believing them. Silas came in and saw her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." She turned the ledger around so he could see. "We did it. We actually did it." He studied the numbers, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled, a real smile, the kind she didn't see often. "Yeah, we did." That night, they celebrated with a bottle of whiskey Walter had given them as a wedding present. They sat on the porch, passing the bottle back and forth, watching the stars come out over the orchard. "You know what I keep thinking?" Evelyn said, slightly buzzed. "What?" "That Thomas would have liked you." Silas took a drink. "You think so?" "Yeah, he always respected people who did good work and didn't complain about it. That was you from day one." "He sounds like he was a good man." "He was." Evelyn took the bottle back. "But you're a good man too. Different, but good." They sat in silence for a while. Then Silas said something that surprised her. "I used to feel guilty about Sarah and the baby, like I should have been able to save them somehow." "You couldn't have saved them. Childbirth is dangerous." "I know. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. Took me 6 years to stop carrying that guilt around like a stone." "What changed?" "You did." He looked at her. "You showed me that survival isn't about perfect choices or avoiding mistakes. It's about getting up every day and doing the work even when it feels impossible." Evelyn felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were the good kind. "We make a hell of a team," she said. "Yeah, we do." The first snow came in mid-November, earlier than usual, but this time the farm was ready. The fields were harvested and cleared. The animals had shelter and feed. The house had enough wood to burn all winter. The pantry was stocked with canned goods and preserved meat. They were prepared. For the first time in 2 years, winter didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a rest. One cold December morning, Evelyn was in the kitchen making bread when she heard voices outside. She looked out the window and saw Clayton Harris on horseback, talking to Silas near the barn. Her heart jumped into her throat. She grabbed her coat and headed outside, ready for whatever fight was coming. But when she got close enough to hear, Clayton wasn't threatening or demanding. He was offering. "Fair market price for the eastern 5 acres, he was saying. "I know the boundary dispute was settled, but I'm still interested in expanding my property in that direction. If you're willing to sell, I'll pay full value. No games, no tricks." Silas crossed his arms. "Why would we sell you anything?" "Because it's business. What happened before, the inspection, the legal troubles, that was business too. Nothing personal." Evelyn stepped forward before Silas could respond. "Nothing personal?" she repeated quietly. "You tried to destroy my farm. You tried to take my land. You watched me struggle and you stayed silent. And now you want to call it business?" Clayton had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Mrs. Mercer, it's Mrs. Reed now." She held up her left hand, showing the iron ring. "And the answer is no. We're not selling you anything. Not 5 acres, not 5 feet. You want land? Buy it from someone who doesn't know what you are." "I'm trying to make this right." "You want to make it right?" Evelyn's voice went hard. "Then tell everyone in town what you did. Stand up in church on Sunday and admit you tried to steal a widow's farm. Confess that you falsified water tests and filed false claims. Do that, and maybe I'll believe you're trying to make something right." Clayton's face flushed red. "You're making a mistake. I could be a valuable ally." "We don't need allies who stab us in the back." Silas moved to stand beside Evelyn. "You heard her. The answer's no. Now get off our property." For a moment it looked like Clayton might argue. Then he seemed to deflate slightly, like a man realizing he'd lost something he couldn't get back. "Fine, but this offer stands if you change your mind." "We won't," Evelyn said. He rode off without another word. After he was gone, Evelyn turned to Silas. "You think we should have taken his money? 5 acres is 5 acres." "You think we should have?" She thought about it. Thought about the cash they could have gotten, the peace it might have bought. Then she thought about the look on Clayton's face when she told him no. "Not for all the money in the county," she said. Silas smiled. "That's my girl." Winter passed slowly but comfortably. Caleb turned 8 in January. They celebrated with a cake Ruth brought over and a new pocket knife Silas had been carving for weeks. The boy was growing tall and strong, his hands developing calluses from farm work. He was learning to read better, do sums faster, think problems through before asking for help. He was becoming the kind of boy who'd grow into the kind of man this land needed. One evening in late February, Evelyn found him in the barn talking to Silas while they repaired harness. "And then what happened?" Caleb was asking. "Then the whole fence line collapsed in the storm. Took us 3 days to rebuild it." "Did you get in trouble?" "Oh, hell yes. My father tanned my hide for not securing the post properly." Caleb laughed, and the sound made Evelyn's heart ache in the best way. She stood in the doorway watching them work together, Silas's patient teaching, Caleb's eager learning, and realized something profound. Her son had a father again, not a replacement for Thomas. Just a different kind of father, quieter, steadier, someone who taught through doing rather than telling. And Caleb was thriving under that attention. Later that night, after Caleb was asleep, Evelyn told Silas what she'd observed. "He looks up to you," she said, "the way he used to look up to Thomas." Silas was quiet for a moment. "I'm not trying to replace—" "I know. But you're giving him something he needs. A man who shows up, who stays, who teaches him how to be strong without being hard. Is that what I'm doing?" "That's exactly what you're doing." She took his hand. "And it means everything to me." Spring came early that year, and with it came the rhythm they'd established. Planning, planting, maintaining, growing. But this time, there was no desperation behind the work. No fear that one bad season would destroy them. They had savings now. Resources. Options. They'd survive the worst and come out stronger. One warm April afternoon, Evelyn was working in the garden when she heard a wagon approach. She looked up and saw Walter, but he wasn't alone. With him were 6 people, farmers she vaguely recognized from surrounding properties. Her guard went up immediately. "Walter, what's this about?" The old shopkeeper climbed down from his wagon looking nervous. "These folks wanted to talk to you. I told them they could, long as they did it respectful." One of the farmers stepped forward, a middle-aged man with weathered hands and honest eyes. "Mrs. Reed, my name's Jack Morrison. I own the property 3 miles south of here." "I know who you are. What do you want?" "We wanted to ask your advice. See, we've all had trouble with our land. Irrigation problems, drainage issues, things we can't figure out. And we heard how you fixed yours with help from your husband here." He gestured to Silas. "We were hoping maybe you'd be willing to share what you learned. Help us figure out what's wrong with our places." Evelyn looked at the 6 faces, all of them showing the same desperate hope she'd carried for 2 years. People who needed help. People who'd probably heard her story and were wondering if they could have the same ending. She glanced at Silas. He shrugged slightly, leaving the decision to her. "It'll cost you," she said finally. Morrison's face fell. "We don't have much, not money, labor. You want our knowledge, you pay and work. When we need harvest help or fence repairs or anything else, you show up. That's the deal." Understanding dawned on Morrison's face. "That's more than fair. Good. Then Silas will come look at your property starting next week. He'll tell you what he sees, what needs fixing. If you want him to help with repairs, we work out terms. Sound fair?" "More than fair, ma'am. Thank you." After they left, Evelyn turned to Silas. "You willing to do that? Help them fix their land?" "Long as it doesn't interfere with our own work, yeah." He smiled slightly. "Besides, feels good to fix things. Missed that." Over the next 2 months, Silas visited 9 different farms. He found collapsed drainage in 3 of them, broken irrigation in 2 others, and soil compaction problems in the rest. Most of the fixes were simple, things that would have cost a fortune if they'd hired experts, but that Silas could diagnose in an afternoon and repair in a week. Word spread. The woman who'd nearly lost her farm was now helping others save theirs. And slowly, grudgingly, Coldwater started to see Evelyn Reed differently. Not as the desperate widow they'd tried to exploit, as someone who'd survived hell and come out the other side willing to help others do the same. One evening in early June, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Evelyn and Silas were walking through the orchard. The trees were heavy with young apples, growing strong and healthy. The irrigation channels hummed with water. The whole farm felt alive in a way it hadn't since before Thomas died. "You know what I realized today?" Evelyn said. "What's that?" "I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy. Not just surviving or getting by. Happy." Silas stopped walking and turned to face her. "Good. You deserve that." "We deserve that." She took his hand. This farm, this life, it's ours. Together. And nobody can take it from us. No, they can't. They stood there in the fading light, surrounded by the land they'd fought for, holding on to each other and the future they'd built from broken pieces. And somewhere in the distance, they could hear Caleb laughing as he chased the dog through the wheat field, the sound of a child who felt safe, who knew home, who understood that sometimes the worst things that happen to you lead to the best things you never saw coming. That autumn, the harvest was extraordinary. The wheat came in thick and golden, the corn stood tall and full, and the orchard produced so many apples that they had to hire extra help just to pick and pack them all. Buyers came from 4 counties over, offering premium prices. The Mercer farm, now the Reed farm, had become known for quality. By October, Evelyn had more money in savings than Thomas had ever managed to put away. She could have used it to expand, to buy more land, to become one of the wealthy ranchers she'd once envied. Instead, she used part of it to pay off 3 small farmers who were struggling the way she had. Anonymous payments sent through Walter, covering debts that would have destroyed them. "You're giving away money we could use," Silas observed, but there was no judgment in his voice. "We've got enough." "They don't." "Seems simple to me." "Nothing about you is simple." "Good. Simple's boring." On a cold November evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the first snowfall. Caleb was nestled between them, half asleep, content. "Tell me a story," he mumbled. "What kind of story?" Evelyn asked. "The one about how you and Silas fixed the farm." She'd told this story a dozen times, but Caleb never tired of hearing it. So she told it again, the broken irrigation line, the desperate repair, the men who tried to take everything, the fight to keep what was theirs. But this time, she added something new at the end. "And you know what the real lesson is?" she said. "What?" "That sometimes the hardest things in life, the things that nearly break you, those are the things that make you stronger than you ever thought possible. Not because they're easy, because they force you to find out what you're really made of." Caleb thought about that. "Are we strong now?" he asked. Evelyn looked at Silas, who was watching her with those steady gray eyes. "Yeah, baby, we're strong." "Good." Caleb yawned. "I like being strong." He fell asleep there on the porch, and Silas carried him inside to bed. When he came back, Evelyn was still sitting in the cold, watching the snow cover the fields that had nearly killed her and then saved her. "You coming in?" Silas asked. "In a minute, just thinking." He sat down beside her, waiting. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't shown up that day?" she asked. "Sometimes. I would have lost everything, the farm, my pride, maybe even Caleb if they'd decided I was unfit." She shook her head. "One stranger showing up at the right time changed my entire life." "Maybe. Or maybe you would have found another way. You're tougher than you give yourself credit for." "We'll never know, will we?" "No, but I'm glad we don't have to." Evelyn leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder. "Me too." They sat there until the cold drove them inside, where the fire was warm and the house smelled like the bread Evelyn had baked that morning. This was home now. Not just a place, but a feeling. Safety. Belonging. The knowledge that you didn't have to face everything alone. And as Evelyn banked the fire for the night and climbed the stairs to the bedroom she now shared with Silas, she thought about how strange life was, how the worst thing that had ever happened to her, Thomas's death, had eventually led to this. Not happiness bought cheap or easily, but happiness earned through blood and sweat and refusing to quit when quitting would have been so much easier. The kind of happiness that tasted like victory. Years later, when people asked Evelyn Reed how she'd saved her farm, she always gave the same answer. "I didn't save it alone." And that's the point. You can't do everything by yourself. Sometimes survival means letting someone help you, even when pride tells you not to. Sometimes strength isn't about standing alone. It's about knowing when to reach out and grab the hand someone's offering. The farm thrived for decades. Caleb grew up strong and capable, eventually taking over operations when Evelyn and Silas got too old for the hardest work. He married a girl from the next county over, a school teacher with a sharp mind and a kind heart. They had 3 children who ran wild through the same orchards their grandmother had fought to save. And every autumn, when the apples came ripe and the fields turned gold, someone would drive past and say, "That's the Reed farm. Used to be cursed, you know." And someone else would always correct them. Wasn't cursed, just broken, but they fixed it, which was the truest thing anyone could say. Because in the end, that's what survival really is. Not avoiding the break, but finding the strength to repair it when it comes, and then building something beautiful from the pieces.